What's up, everybody? We are live with the Awesemo Waiver Wire Show, the Week 9 edition. I am your host, Matt Gajewski, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Kyle Dvorchak. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski, and you can follow him at Kyle Tweets here. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. We are so close to 40K subscribers, and hit that notification bell so you know when this and all other videos go live. Of course, today's show is sponsored by Yahoo Daily Fantasy Sports, the most trusted name in fantasy sports. Yahoo DFS now includes CSV uploads, CSV edit features for those looking to play multiple lineups. Make better choices, choose Yahoo Daily Fantasy. Kyle, how are you today? How was your week 8?
It was good. I have both in season long and in a lot of DFS, had a lot of Dalvin Cook, ran him back with some Devontae Adams, so that was fun. Jimmy Garoppolo turns out to be bad. So does Ben DiNucci and a lot of other teams. There are a lot of really not that good teams and 6 good teams. I think I'm convinced there are 6 good teams.
For what it's worth, I don't disagree. Of course, today's waiver wire show, we are going to get to all of the big injury news. I feel like this is one of the weeks where we didn't have a ton of injury news, at least not some of the devastating injuries we've seen in the past. But Kyle, I have to ask you, Antonio Brown is coming back, or at least he's eligible to this week. Before we even get into the show, I just want to ask you what you make of the Antonio Brown situation. I know Chris Godwin is out tonight. We haven't had the Tampa Bay Buccaneers play yet. But before we go, what is kind of the long-term outlook for Antonio Brown? Do you think this is a guy people should be immediately inserting into their lineup? Should they just be holding, waiting, and see what happens? What do we do with Antonio Brown?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because right now Chris Godwin is dealing with a fractured finger. And although they said it's a short-term injury, they didn't even say it was a 1-week injury. We could see him out for another week or two. Essentially what I'm saying is we could have a week with AB and no Chris Godwin. We'll have to wait and see, obviously. But if that's the case, I would say at that point, yes, you probably can start Antonio Brown in his first game. If he returns to, or if he returns to the field with Chris Godwin on the field as well, I think at that point, I'm probably much more hesitant because they already have, I don't know, he's not really been alpha Mike Evans, but they have a guy named Mike Evans, and then they have Chris Godwin. At that point, how much room is there for Antonio Brown in his first game? It would seem like there's probably not a lot. So it basically depends on if Chris Godwin is in the lineup. If Chris Godwin's out, I think Antonio Brown probably slots into a similar-ish role.
He does move into a crowded receiving core. You mentioned Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, but Rob Gronkowski has seen some elevated opportunity shares as well. It's not like Antonio Brown is going to be walking into the 25+% target share that he has seen in previous years. It's more of a wait and see approach for me, unless we get the news Chris Godwin is missing multiple weeks. But as we move forward, guys, we are going to go position by position through the waiver wire, give our takes, who got hurt, who played poorly, and who should we pick up. And starting with the quarterback position, there weren't a ton of injuries coming into the week. Andy Dalton, of course, had this severe concussion. We may see him again this week, but it's a pretty bleak situation in Dallas. Gardner Minshew popped up. They didn't even run an injury report, but during the bye, we got news that Gardner Minshew is hurt and he is unlikely to play this week. And Jimmy Garoppolo also left last week's game. It's kind of cloudy whether he was benched or if the injury was just enough where they're like, all right, Jimmy Garoppolo, let's get you healthy and we'll play you again another day. What do you make of the injury situation? And, is there someone potentially that we want to grab off the waiver wire, just arms and legs above everyone else? I think it's kind of a tough week.
Yeah, it is a tough week for Jimmy Garoppolo and Gardner Minshew. Both of them are kind of in similar situations where the injury is what is cited for Garoppolo. I think it's supposedly some sort of re-aggravation of the ankle injury. Minshew is like torn ligaments in his thumb and fractured bones or something. I don't know. He just put in a meat grinder. But they come on the heels of either for Garoppolo, a terrible game similar to the game where he got railroaded by Miami, I think, or Gardner Minshew, where he's been fine, but basically since week 1, they haven't won a single game. Minshew has probably not done enough. I don't think he's bad, but at this point, it's probably safe to say he's probably not the franchise guy either. So there is, this ambiguous situation where are either of them, yes, they're technically benched because of injuries, but do we see them once they're healthy come back? I don't know. So neither of these guys are inspiring much for me. I'm definitely not playing them when they return in fantasy. And in regards to like the Andy Dalton injury, oh my God, Ben DiNucci is so bad. I'm not sure how this could have been predicted that seventh round, third string quarterback Ben DiNucci would be bad, but he is. In terms of who we are picking up, yeah, it's not a great week. I think maybe the obvious one in terms of guys who are owned in less than half of leagues per Yahoo, but this is probably fairly similar across all formats. Kirk Cousins owned in less than a third of leagues. In fact, versus the Detroit Lions. I mean, we saw the Lions absolutely give it up to Indy. They've given it up to multiple teams, and their offense is competent, so this could be a potential shootout spot. And although Kirk Cousins didn't really do anything last week, they didn't have to because Dalvin Cook absolutely crushed in a very windy game environment, so everything aligned for them to not need to use Kirk Cousins. I think they have a more balanced approach. They're still one of the more run-heavy teams in the NFL, but not to the extent that we saw last week. So hopefully people recognize or don't recognize, I guess, what happened last week. And they say, oh, I'm not going to pick up Kirk Cousins. I think he's the number one ad.
I agree with you. And just for clarification, we are talking all players that are available in 50% or more of leagues. And I think the saving grace on the waiver wire this week is, there's not that many teams on bye. And the teams that are on bye, it's Carson Wentz, it's Justin Herbert, Baker Mayfield, and Joe Burrow. Out of that group, I think only Justin Herbert and maybe Joe Burrow were clear-cut starters. You're certainly not starting Carson Wentz and Baker Mayfield outside of 2 QB leagues or super flex leagues on a weekly basis. So maybe that helps you. Not a ton of teams on bye, so you probably don't have to get all the way in the weeds with these quarterbacks. I think if you have someone like Cam Newton on your team, maybe you do want to consider a player like Kirk Cousins. And then we'll go deep for you guys. You guys out there in the deep leagues, we got you. I think outside of Kirk Cousins, there's a couple players in interesting spots. Maybe not the best names we want to target. Someone that sticks out to me, and I'm going to say it, Kyle, it's Nick Foles playing against the Tennessee Titans, another defense we've seen really struggle this year and get into a fair amount of shootouts. Nick Foles, I don't think has really impressed. Basically, every time I watch him, he's underthrowing Darnell Mooney on potential touchdowns. But we like the pass attempts. Chicago is passing at one of the highest rates in the NFL, mainly because they've been trailing a lot in games. So against the Tennessee Titans in a potential shootout, I think we could do a lot worse than Nick Foles. He would be my number 2 ad behind Kirk Cousins, although I don't feel great about it. Is there someone else you might look to? I'm looking at the list of available quarterbacks, and I'm seeing, Derek Carr against the Chargers, Tua Tagovailoa available against the Cardinals. He played just terribly last week. Daniel Jones against the Washington football team, Phillip Rivers against the Baltimore Ravens. A lot of the available quarterbacks are in just really tough matchups.
Yeah, so I think that's the thing is usually when I look at streaming quarterbacks, I look at the good matchups. Who do we have in the good matchups? Well, I see, Atlanta. Someone's playing Atlanta and they're low owned. Oh, it's Drew Lock. I'm not playing like matchup is good, but you still need to be a decent quarterback. And Drew Lock, although he played well against the Chargers for a half, he wasn't very good in the first half. That's just not enough for me to get on board with him. So when I look at the next best matchups, it's matchups like the Lions and Titans. Nick Foles, I agree, is kind of the clear number 2. He's thrown multiple touchdowns in 2 games. He's thrown a touchdown in every game he's played but one. He's not great, but he's fine. He hit Darnell Mooney for a touchdown too, so we finally got Darnell Mooney season. Outside of that, there's not a lot. I'm you're our resident college football expert. Who is Jake Luton?
He is the former signal caller for the Oregon State Beavers. And as you can tell, he was not a highly touted prospect, and he is currently only owned in 1% of leagues. That's for a good reason, but he is going to be the quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And that is notable because they are playing the Houston Texans this week, who have arguably one of the worst secondaries in football. And we know for a fact that Houston is going to rack up points themselves. I don't feel good about Jake Luton in his first NFL start, but I think we could also do worse. I mean, would you prefer Jake Luton over Sam Darnold against the New England Patriots? Would you prefer him over Daniel Jones against the football team?
Yeah, so I like Daniel Jones versus the football team specifically because the last time we saw him play Washington was 2 weeks ago. Maybe by the time they play, it'll have been 3 weeks ago. But he ran for 74 yards on 7 carries, I believe, if I have the stat line pulled up. Yeah, it is versus Washington. 2 weeks ago is the time we're recording this. They'll have an extra game in between. 7 for 74. And it's I think it's probably the opposite of it being a good matchup for Daniel Jones. It's because teams that get pressure on Daniel Jones force him to run the football. He's played top 10 teams in terms of sacks generated, and he's rushed well against all of them. He's averaging over 50 yards per game against those teams. Because when they get to him, he breaks the pocket and he runs a lot. It's not probably a great real-life football situation because those games probably also feature a lot of sacks. But I don't care about sacks. I don't lose any points for sacks. So I think Daniel Jones versus a team that can force him to run the football is quite interesting. That appears to be the case with Washington. So I think I would take him over Lutton potentially. I think that's probably the tiebreaker. But yes, I would take him over Kyle Allen versus the Giants. I'd take him over Sam Darnold versus anyone. I don't care. I'd even take him over Drew Lock versus Atlanta. Certainly a better the cakewalk matchup versus Atlanta, but I just don't want to play Drew Lock.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Daniel Jones, that rushing equity is enough to often get you to a usable fantasy week. And we've seen it in the past. We saw it with the 80 yards should be touchdown run where Daniel Jones just fell down, one of the least athletic plays I've ever seen, but that's neither here nor there. To sum up the quarterback position on the waiver wire, for me, it's going to be Kirk Cousins, number 1 against Detroit. I'll take Nick Foles, number 2 against Tennessee. Once you get to number 3, I hope you don't have to get here, but Daniel Jones could make some sense against the Washington football team. I really want to say Tua Tagovailoa because he's got a nice matchup against an Arizona team that often gets into shootouts as well, but man, I just don't think I can go there after what I saw from Tua in his first game. Hopefully he improves. That is in the realm of possibility. How are you ranking the QBs on the waiver wire?
Yeah, for me, Cousins 1, Foles 2, Daniel Jones 3, Lutton 4, and if you're getting to 5, I think there's a cutoff. I think Daniel Jones is a passable player. If you're getting to 5, oh man, I pray for you because it is a scary sight probably after those top 4, and frankly, there's a top 2 as well. I think Cousins and Foles are actually totally equitable players. You can get some fantasy points out of them. I think your floor drops off of a cliff when you go to Lutton and Jones, but at least they have reasonable similar ceilings. So. Big 2, Cousins, Foles, then Jones, Lutton as fun upside plays. If you're getting to 5, maybe your season's just done already.
I agree. Now, listen, guys, you can get access to all the great Awesemo Plus tools and content for nearly every DFS sport out there with an Awesemo Plus weekly pass for $29.95. This includes full access to all the premium content and tools on Awesemo.com, including player projections, ownership projections, our premium Slack channel, and much more. Looking to only play NFL? Then sign up for our weekly NFL package for only $14.95 or give our NFL Weekly Express Pass a shot for $3.95. Stop guessing, start winning. Join Awesemo Plus today. Kyle, as we move forward to the running back position, it's been an oft-injured position this year, and we saw maybe not quite the same extent of injuries, but there were a couple again. Tevin Coleman, he re-aggravates his injury just a few carries into the game. Darrell Henderson also aggravates an injury he had been dealing with. But outside of that, it's basically just previous injuries. We have Kenyon Drake expected to miss this week with ligament tears in his ankle. Chris Carson was a game time decision, so he missed this previous game. I think he'll be back just based on the current timetable. He was supposed to be a 50-50 to go on Sunday, ultimately didn't suit up. Miles Sanders missed the previous week. Little more questions with him, but his was supposed to just be a couple of games. Mark Ingram has been trending the wrong direction after we thought he would just miss a couple. And then, of course, Devontae Freeman, he's on the shelf as well. As far as runners that are available, it's pretty bleak on the waiver wire. Most of the handcuffs for these players are already owned, except for one situation, and it's San Francisco. Tell the people about JaMycal Hasty and why is he working ahead of Jerick McKinnon?
Yeah, so JaMycal Hasty is just this college committee back from Baylor, and the only reason we even knew his name before he cropped up as a viable fantasy player was that supposedly he was having a really impressive training camp, but doesn't even end up making the final roster. So, do I think he's this immense talent? No, I don't think that's the case at all. But do I think if he's going to get used on one of the most used and most efficient running offenses in the league, should we be picking him up as a priority? Absolutely. And why is he playing over Jerick McKinnon? I'm honestly not sure. We saw early in the season, when all of the injuries happened prior, we saw Jerick McKinnon getting up to nearly 20 touches in a game. It's not happening. So I'm not really sure why we're not seeing a lot of Jerick McKinnon. Maybe they have just landed on using Jerick McKinnon specifically as this kind of specialty role player. And that leaves a lot of volume on the bone for JaMycal Hasty. So I actually think there's one player that maybe will go underrated that I'll throw out to you before we get to the injury situations. Damian Harris, is he just taking over as the primary ball carrier? No pass catching upside, but is he taking over as the primary ball carrier in New England?
He could be, and I found it notable. He didn't play as much even as players like Rex Burkhead. I know he had the large run in there. My concern with Damian Harris long-term is he will be in a timeshare. I don't know what the degree it'll be if he'll handle 50, 60, or 70% of the opportunities, but we know Rex Burkhead and James White will be a factor at least to some degree. We also know New England's offense is not the New England offense of old. If Damian Harris isn't ripping off huge long runs? What do we expect from him long term? For me, I think he's more of a speculative ad, and I would definitely put JaMychal Hasty over him and probably some of the runners we're going to discuss in a second. Do you have a different take on Damian Harris?
I think I have a little bit more of the same take, but more optimistic. I guess like the perfect comparison is like Damian Harris versus Wayne Gallman, because like basically the same thing, where I guess Wayne Gallman arguably will probably see more targets because Damian Harris will probably see no targets. I think he saw like one target in the past 2 or 3 games. So, but Damian Harris is going to probably see, and he has led the team in carries in, I believe, 4 consecutive weeks. He has 2 weeks over 100 yards. He's kind of the same thing as Wayne Gallman, where like, what is the upside on his offense? It's probably a lot of volume that doesn't turn into a ton of efficiency, but like Harris could actually be good, whereas like Wayne Gallman's probably not good. So I think Damian Harris is probably in the top 3 or 4 range. Maybe that's just because I don't want to play a ton of Giants. Like I'm a little bit more conservative on guys like Gallman. I'm a little bit more conservative on a situation we have here, Cam Akers versus Malcolm Brown. I think we're just getting the Darrell Henderson treatment all over again with Cam Akers, in that they take this highly touted rookie and they just they're just refusing to use him. Even when Darrell Henderson gets hurt, it's Malcolm Brown who comes out and gets like a majority of the touches, a majority of the snaps. Why do they love Malcolm Brown so much? He is the most just a guy player I have ever seen, and they continue to feed him.
I don't have the answer to this. I thought they were firmly going to use their second round pick in Cam Akers, a really impressive prospect coming out of Florida State, and they just haven't. And we've seen them do this before. They even did it last year with another highly touted prospect coming out of Memphis, and Darrell Henderson, who's the injured back we are discussing here. To sum up that Wayne Gallman versus Damian Harris situation a bit, I think, not knowing the full timetable of Devontae Freeman's injury, we will get a full workload out of Wayne Gallman for a longer period of time. Wayne Gallman is not splitting work whatsoever. If we just look to the previous game when Devontae Freeman left after touching the ball 4 times, Wayne Gallman handled 10 carries and 5 targets. Deion Lewis mixed in for just 3 carries, no targets himself. You mentioned Wayne Gallman as a pass catcher. He has played in spot duty occasionally through his career. There was a stretch of time back in 2017 where he was filling in, and he had target counts of 9, 7, and 8 in 3 back-to-back games. So he is a pass catcher. I don't know how efficient he actually is as a pass catcher. And I also don't know how efficient this Giants offense is going to be. But Wayne Gallman should handle somewhere between 15 to 20 touches in place of Devontae Freeman until that time. So that's why he gets a slight nod over Damian Harris for me. But man, this LA Rams situation, like, what do you think the opportunity share is going? Say Darrell Henderson misses this upcoming week. What would you peg the running back split between Malcolm Brown and Cam Akers to be?
I think it's probably somewhere around a 50-50 of the carries, but Malcolm Brown takes almost the entirety of the pass catching role, which is really why I would have not no interest, absolutely not no interest, but I would have tempered expectations on Cam Akers, simply because they have used Malcolm Brown. Even though Darrell Henderson kind of profiles, and I know he's graded well by PFF as a pass catcher, they continue to use Malcolm Brown, and maybe it's because like his pass blocking upside, his pass blocking floor, essentially, that they are fine and comfortable with him running the routes, picking up blitzes. But Malcolm Brown is going to be the third down back. So that really gives you a 50-50 split, or maybe you get more, maybe you get a 60-40 split, but that's exclusively of the carries for Cam Akers. So I think his upside is like a more modest version of what we've seen from Darrell Henderson, which is like acceptable RB2-3 numbers, but it just doesn't scream like having a ton of value. Whereas like if they don't like Cam Akers, Malcolm Brown could actually go out and see the bulk of the carries and all of the backfield targets. So I think Malcolm Brown has, like, as long as Darrell Henderson is out, which we don't know yet, but if he is out, does actually have like a lot of individual upside on any given week.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. From a waiver wire perspective, from a team building sense, I don't think it does. Cam Akers actually had 30 receptions his final year in college, which is extremely good for a college back. So I don't know how he got pulled into this 2-down grinder role. It doesn't really make sense to me, but we have to go with how coaches are using him, not our own talent evaluations. And Cam Akers, he is not the pass catching back. So that would lead me to try to roster Malcolm Brown over Akers. Just for your reference, they are both widely available in over 50% of leagues. So if you're choosing between them, Malcolm Brown gets the lean. The previous backs we mentioned, Wayne Gallman is only owned in 23% of leagues. Damian Harris, 46, and JaMychal Hasty, a 42% ownership on him. All of them widely available. Preference right now is Hasty, then for me, Gallman, then probably Malcolm Brown. Don't feel good about it. But one guy we haven't mentioned yet who's kind of mixed in here is Gus Edwards. So it's Gus Edwards over J.K. Dobbins, just because J.K. Dobbins is owned in too many leagues already. But Gus Edwards, he's only owned in 30%. What is this injury prognosis with Mark Ingram? It's kind of been muted. People haven't really been talking a lot about Mark Ingram's injury status, and it seems like it's gotten worse. Where are you prioritizing Edwards?
Yeah, so originally the diagnosis is that he would probably come back in like basically last week now as of Monday or this coming week. And it seems like maybe we're still another week or two out. It was either like a Schefter or a Rappaport tweet that, it basically kind of upgraded his diagnosis from like a low ankle sprain to a mid to high ankle sprain. I still don't think he's like out for any extended period of time, but could you get half of Baltimore's running back carries for a week or maybe even 2 weeks by picking up Gus Edwards? Absolutely. You could net that off the waiver wire. And when you can get that, I think you should be targeting that. Gus Edwards scored the touchdown, but it was J.K. Dobbins who topped 100 yards. He's been incredibly elusive, but they don't seem to want to give him this 3-down role. As long as that's the case, kind of the same thing with Malcolm Brown, Cam Akers. We have this young, what we perceive to be a talented running back who they seem to not want to give the ball, at least not as much as we would like. You kind of have to go on what the coaches are telling us. The coaches are telling us Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins are going to completely split the backfield carries. So Gus Edwards could be a good 1 or 2 week rental, basically like the same role as Damian Harris, but on an offense that I'd rather target.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think there are a lot of leagues that will have to play Gus Edwards because of the injuries we mentioned at the top. Now, if we're trying to rank these guys, I'm going to try to make it easy for you guys. In preference of where I would pick these guys up on the waiver wire, for me, it's Hasty number 1, Wayne Gallman number 2. I'll give Malcolm Brown number 3, Gus Edwards 4, Damian Harris 5. Would you change that ranking at all, Kyle?
No, I really don't like putting Wayne Gallman this high, but like he's the only guy out of this group where we could actually see like a decent amount of sustained volume. Whereas like we don't even know if Malcolm, like we don't know the status on Darrell Henderson. We don't know if he's going to even miss time. So yeah, I think Gallman is begrudgingly number 2, Hasty 1. Yeah, Brown 3. Maybe you could even argue like Gus Edwards 3. Those guys are kind of interchangeable. And Damian Harris, I think maybe has maybe the most long-term floor, but his upside is so capped because he will never catch a pass this season.
I think it makes sense. And just to cap off the running back position, for you guys that are in deeper leagues, I think some speculative ads, if you have a deep bench, I think going for some handcuffs can make some sense. And a few that are widely available, Alexander Madison's only owned in 44% of leagues. If Dalvin Cook goes down, he's just a smash. We have Tony Pollard, 19% owned. He's slowly siphoning more work for Zeke. I don't think he'll ever work into like a full workload with Zeke there. But if Zeke goes down, same thing. A lot of pass catching ability for Tony Pollard. We've already seen Brian Hill move into Todd Gurley's workload a little bit. He's 11% owned. And Jonathan Taylor's just been so bad to start the year that Jordan Wilkins at 2% ownership. If the Jonathan Taylor struggles continue, maybe Jordan Wilkins continues to roll in there with a few carries here and there. Anyone else you might look to speculatively?
Yeah, Alexander Madison is probably like one of the premier ones, but he's owned in almost half of leagues. He still makes the threshold, but we'll move on from him. Tony Pollard, I don't think you should be rostering Tony Pollard at this point because the upside is that he comes in like that, Zeke's knee blows up and then Tony Pollard comes in and gets like 20 carries for 60 yards and 5 catches for 10 yards. Like
that's usable in these leagues, man.
It's usable, but like Alexander Madison's upside is he comes in and he's Dalvin Cook. Even like Brian Hill is like Todd Gurley's going to outscore, Ezekiel Elliott from here on out because they're basically just the Jets playing in different uniforms at this point. There's no upside. The upside is being like an RB3, which man, this Dallas offense is going to be just god awful. So I don't think you really should be rostering Tony Pollard that much. I'd much rather look to Jordan Wilkins, who could actually give you production now. And his offense isn't that bad. They're fine. The Colts are a fine team. So if he's going to get 20 carries in a game, seems unlikely that continues to happen. But if he's going to work over Jonathan Taylor, he's a guy who could be like the between the tackles version of like early season Chase Edmonds, where we're like, I don't know, man, if you need 4 catches, we're like, well, I don't know. If you need 14 carries, you can probably get him with Jordan Wilkins.
It's true. I agree with your ranking, and I agree with the Jordan Wilkins take. Guys, of course, there's free content every single day at Awesemo.com. Today, we are recording this on Monday. We have NFL Top Showdown plays. But if you're watching this on Tuesday, there's, of course, more different free content every single day. One of the biggest tools you can get for free is the Awesemo Odd Shopper tool, one of my very favorite tools. If you are a bettor, check this out for free on the site. It allows you to search odds, lines, totals, player props across different books, and you can find the best price, which is extremely important to long-term profitability when you're sports betting. So head over to Awesemo specifically oddshopper.awesemo.com, and you can sign up there, track your bets, get alerts when they hit a certain price. All of it is free, best of all. Kyle, as we move to the wide receiver position, I guess there were a few notable injuries. I think first and foremost, one that may have gone overlooked is Calvin Ridley because the injury occurred on Thursday, but we also saw Kenny Golladay go down, T.Y. Hilton went down, Deontay Johnson briefly, he returned to the game, Adam Humphries with a concussion, I believe it was. But those are a couple really big name receivers, particularly Ridley and Golladay. Is there someone you think steps up in their place? I mean, Marvin Jones is available. He's nearly owned in 50% of leagues, but Russell Gage, he's only owned in 13%. I know we don't typically see wide receiver handcuffs come into play in fantasy football, but both of those replacements are widely available. And I would just want to get your take on how you're treating them.
Yeah, shout out to Marvin Jones for getting in 49% of leagues so we can talk about him. Interestingly, it was Marvin Hall who led the team in targets. Marvin Hall is a guy who actually I like because he's a guy who basically his yards per target is always sky high because he gets 8 targets in a season and breaks one of them for a long one every single season. And he did that again this week. He had like a 70-yard catch or something. So maybe it's not as much that I think you should be picking up Marvin Hall, is that you should probably have muted expectations for Marvin Jones because although I believe he scored twice, it wasn't on insane volume. It's because, like you said, we don't really see handcuff wide receivers. It's just not a thing. It's not the way NFL offenses operate that they can just plug Marvin Jones into the Kenny Golladay role. So should you probably be starting Marvin Jones if Kenny Golladay is out? Unless your receivers are really good, yeah, you probably should. But should you expect him to take over a massive role? I don't think so. I'd be more concerned about the role we see from Marvin Jones. I still think he's one of the better pickups, but he's not head and shoulders the best. Russell Gage is fine, but even he, the same thing. His starting receiver gets injured, and he doesn't see a ton of volume. I think Hayden Hurst outscored him, and I know that because played a lot of Russell Gage on the showdown slate, and that didn't work out. So do I think he steps into a massive role? No, but do I think he's fantasy viable? Yeah, that's probably the case. That's what I have about these guys. One thing of note, maybe this is Adam Humphries, maybe it's not, but Corey Davis goes out, and I believe he has played in 3 games with A.J. Brown. He has out-targeted A.J. Brown in all of them. And Corey Davis was a good college prospect. He was either a rookie or a second-year breakout in the NFL, and then he kind of just crashes back down to earth. Is there no reason, can we not believe that Corey Davis maybe won't be out-targeting A.J. Brown on a weekly basis, but will be a viable wide receiver 3 on an offense that has been incredibly efficient at producing big plays and touchdowns? I think maybe we are too low on Corey Davis because recently, for 2 years, he has burned us.
Yeah, I think it's a long sample of Corey Davis being bad at football, and I think you could rationalize some of that away due to injury, but not all of it. At a certain point, you have to produce on the fantasy football or on the football field and for fantasy, that is. But Corey Davis just hasn't been able to do it for whatever reason. I certainly do not think he is going to be the wide receiver 1 in Tennessee, and that's a team that's fairly run heavy overall. So I think some weeks maybe Corey Davis pops up for usable weeks, but in the context of the waiver wire right now, I certainly prefer Russell Gage and Marvin Jones over him just based on opportunity. One last thing on the Russell Gage situation. I think you're onto something. When Julio Jones was up earlier this year, it wasn't Russell Gage that stepped up immediately to absorb all that opportunity. And we actually saw Atlanta struggle. That's something that might happen again here. So maybe a tiebreaker here if you want to bring Russell Gage down a little bit and target a guy like Corey Davis. It's possible. But either way, I still think there's a player on the waiver wire that is better than both of them, Corey Davis and Russell Gage, that is. And it's Allen Lazard. And Allen Lazard, extremely efficient, even had a monster game before he ends up having core muscle surgery, misses 4 weeks of time. But we saw Allen Lazard return to practice last week. Green Bay didn't end up activating him, so they technically didn't have to list him with an injury designation. But as long as Allen Lazard is practicing, I think it puts him tentatively on track to play this week. And if not this week, in the near future. How are you prioritizing him?
Yeah, I would be a little bit more concerned with the injury. If you need locked in production right now, maybe you're a little bit more concerned that he comes back to a not entirely full role because, they could want to ease him. And I know there have also been rumors that they would trade for a guy like Will Fuller. So do you start him this week coming off the injury? I don't know. Maybe you feel a little safer with a guy like Marvin Jones because there will be a role there. But is your long-term upside probably higher with Lazard than I think maybe anyone else? Yeah, it almost certainly is because we've seen Marquez Valdes-Scantling go out and just jam in air yards and do nothing with them. If they have a role, which clearly Marquez Valdes-Scantling's volume shows, that is the often used field stretcher opposite Devontae Adams, that role exists and Marquez Valdes-Scantling says it does, there are a lot of fantasy points to be had. We just haven't seen them be had yet because Marquez Valdes-Scantling just runs wind sprints. So Allen Lazard is probably the highest upside other than potentially Jalen Reagor. How do you feel about Reagor? My big concern with Reagor is that Fulgham is like, yeah, he's playing like a stud. I'm not sure I'm going to say he is this alpha number one receiver, but I'll be damned if he isn't playing like an alpha number one receiver, leads his team in targets over the past 4 weeks, has multiple scores. It all looks to be there for Travis Fulgham. Does that concern you on the Jalen Reagor front?
Yeah, it does for sure. I think with Reagor, he's just, of course, it was his first game in multiple weeks. It's a tentative situation where we just don't know what's going to happen. So with some of the untapped upside we have with Reagor, it's going to give me someone else we have just below him on the list is, like Sterling Shepard, who's playing in a terrible offense, but we'll see some targets. But I think there's questions whether he's the number one wide receiver. Even if he is the de facto number one wide receiver, Darius Slayton's going to be right behind him. With Reagor, I think there's the upside that he overtakes Fulgham. I don't think it's likely, but the upside is there, which gives me, the edge to take him over a guy like Sterling Shepard. So that's why I do like Reagor as a speculative add more than anything. Again, he's available in 75% of leagues, so you can get Reagor pretty easily across these leagues. That's less ownership than Allen Lazard, Sterling Shepard, and Marvin Jones, just for what it's worth. So that's what do you think about Reagor?
Yeah, I think I'm not so sure I see the target upside just because of Fulgham and Dallas Goedert, who did nothing. I think he was targeted once or twice in his return. But I do believe that on a healthy Dallas Goedert offense, he is not only an integral piece. Arguably, he plays the Zach Ertz role, and he does it better than Zach Ertz has done this year. So do we see Jalen Reagor operate as the number 2 pass catcher? Maybe not even. Maybe he's the number 3 pass catcher. So I think there's a ton of upside. I liked him as a college prospect, but I do think in terms of the immediate target volume, is just meh.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. For me, it's an upside play. Now, ranking these guys across the waiver wire, I think for me, it's Marvin Jones number 1. But again, he's not going to be available in all of your leagues. Again, he's 49% owned, so just barely meets our threshold. After him, I do like Allen Lazard. I think he could play this week, and I think they're already kind of easing him back into action without getting him game time snaps like he practiced this week. So he's my number 2. Number 3, I'll go Gage just because of the pass heaviness of Atlanta's offense. Again, he's not Julio Jones. He's not Calvin Ridley, so don't expect that kind of production, but I think he'll be usable. Number 4 for me is Reagor, more of that speculative play. And I'll go Sterling Shepard after that just because he's a locked-in target guy. And as far as Sterling Shepard versus Corey Davis, we don't know the extent of Adam Humphries' injury. If we knew Adam Humphries was out 1 week, I would prefer Shepard. If we knew Adam Humphries was out the rest of the year, it would bump up Corey Davis significant for me. So I think Corey Davis might become wide receiver 3 on our list if we knew Adam Humphries was out extended time. That's kind of how I'll break that down. What are you making of the ranking?
Yeah, I agree. Marvin Jones not available in a ton of leagues, just about half. But if he's available, he's the number 1. Allen Lazard, number 2. Maybe you're a little bit concerned with playing him this week because we don't know what his role will be upon returning, but it should be a very viable role moving forward. So probably the most upside of any of these guys. And if you can afford to stash anyone, I'd say he arguably takes priority over Marvin Jones. If you're just looking for a guy who could potentially win you weeks, I think in the long term, there's probably even more Lazard so than Jones, but Jones gives you more production right now. Number 3, Russell Gage, mostly because we've seen Russell Gage play a role when they have all their receivers healthy. So you have to think maybe there's room for expansion with Calvin Ridley potentially missing time. Number 4, Jalen Reagor. I think there's probably a fall off number 3 where you're just shooting for upside with Jalen Reagor. I'm not sure you're locking him in every week. I'm going to give it to Corey Davis for number 5. I think there's more upside by targeting a Corey Davis, even though maybe you get more targets from Sterling Shepard. What are those targets worth when they're low ADOT targets coming from Daniel Jones? Whereas Corey Davis, maybe fewer targets, but they're farther downfield and they're on an offense that has been incredibly efficient under Ryan Tannehill. And I don't know, he had an okay second-year breakout. He was an incredible college prospect. He's had flashes. I think he had a big game versus New England in his rookie season in which he basically missed most of it because of injuries. There is some history of okay production. It's not great, but there is some history of production, and his college profile is incredible. And maybe this is just the dynasty player in me coming out.
I don't hate it, man. I liked Corey Davis as a prospect too, so I'm hopeful for his ascendance. Hopefully it was just injury related. As we get to tight end, the most brutal position in fantasy football, we potentially lost a stud. Pour one out for George Kittle. Hopefully George Kittle is just temporary absence, and I hope he doesn't miss any time, but if he does come out with an injury, hopefully it is not significant. With that said, heading to the waiver wire, it is one of the most barren position groups in all of fantasy football. First and foremost, we've said this the last couple of weeks, but Houston just had their bye. I think whoever the Houston tight end is the number one waiver ad, and they are both available. Darren Fells is only owned in 7% of leagues, and we have Jordan Akins at 2%. Jordan Akins was running ahead of Fells prior to the injury. Do you agree with that? Is there someone you'd prefer over the Fells, Akins, whoever's playing for Houston?
Yeah, yeah, it really is. If Jordan Akins is healthy early in the season, he was running as clearly the pass catching tight end. Darren Fells was largely used as a blocker. He got a little work in the red zone, so that's not great for Jordan Akins, but Akins has a decent amount of upside if he ends up playing. And if not, Darren Fells is forced into that role. And he's been quite a good touchdown producer and has been getting volume when forced into that role. I don't think that's their ideal choice, but it is what it is. And if Darren Fells is going to be on the field for nearly every snap with Deshaun Watson, yeah, I think these guys are the perfect, they're exemplary streaming tight ends.
Outside of that, so the tight ends that are close to the ownership threshold, we're talking Eric Ebron, Dalton Schultz, Logan Thomas, Chris Herndon, Greg Olsen. It's a lot of tight ends that are playing a lot. It's basically that low calorie role where they're running routes, they're not seeing any targets, and you need a touchdown for them to hit value. And it's a bunch of tight ends I'm not really interested in rostering. So if I'm playing someone else on the waiver wire, it's honestly probably Jordan Reed, who's 2% owned because, of course, he's behind Kittle. But Jordan Reed, I think, would step into more of a full-time role and a pass-catching role, given the fact that Deebo Samuel's hurt too. So tentatively, if Kittle misses time, he's my tight end too. What do you make of Jordan Reed?
Yeah, so we might have to watch and wait on Jordan Reed. As of right now, he has not been activated off of injured reserve yet, but he was a guy who's designated to return. And his timetable, he was injured in week 3. It was a 1.5 to 2 month timetable. So that puts him around between weeks 9 and 11 to be specific. That puts him to return right now. And maybe they push him to return as early as possible because they don't have Kittle potentially. And Kittle doesn't sound like ideal for him. They took him in for x-rays and I believe it was on his ankle or his foot, and it didn't return anything. It was negative. So it means he is not a long-term injury, but anytime a guy goes in for x-rays, they are at least fearing something bad has happened. So I don't know if we'll see him this week, and potentially could be a good scoring game versus Green Bay. So I think, yeah, if Jordan Reed is going to play, he's probably a very viable option. If not, any interest in Ross Dwelley, he basically would just fill into that role. He would be the next guy. George Kittle, immensely talented, plays a large role. Jordan Reed, probably still talented, would play a large role. Ross Dwelley, I don't know how talented he will be, but he did get 4 targets in the last time we saw him play in this role. And I think he got 4 targets again versus Seattle, and he scored on 1 of them.
He would fall behind the next 2 guys on the list, which are Trey Burton and Irv Smith. And Trey Burton, he's just playing a pass-catching role for Indianapolis, a quietly, fairly efficient offense that doesn't have a number 1 pass catcher and just lost T.Y. Hilton. So he's my number 3. Irv Smith is playing a similar role to Trey Burton. It's kind of a Trey Burton light role in Minnesota, just an offense that's not passing a ton. It has 2 clear pass catchers that are above him in the target totem pole. So if I'm ranking these tight ends right now, it's Houston tight end number 1, Fells or Akins, whoever's active. Reed 2, assuming he plays and assuming Kittle is out. Burton is 3. Irv Smith would be my 4th. Any difference for you?
Yeah, I just think one guy I'd maybe throw into the mix in the likes. I don't know about over, but in the likes with, a Burton or an Irv Smith is Logan Thomas. Probably plays a larger share of his offense, plays a larger role, but on, a downright terrible offense in Washington. Any love for Logan Thomas now that he's finally scoring touchdowns and getting catches, although it's still only on a handful of targets per game. Yeah,
he's in the same range as the Chris Herndon, Greg Olsen, Dalton Schultz. He needs a touchdown or he's not getting it done for you.
Yeah, it's tough being on Washington. I will say he has 4 targets in every single game this year. So he's fine.
I can't trust Kyle Allen, man. So if you need him, he's playing a lot of snaps, but he'd be behind the other tight ends we mentioned. As far as defense goes, defensive streaming, very common week to week. It's a bad week for it. A lot of the streaming defenses are in tough matchups. There's one in particular I think that's very nice. You kind of poked holes in it earlier, but it's Washington against the New York Giants. You get that terrible New York Giants offensive line against a very stout Washington defensive line. And I know Daniel Jones was able to evade some pressure in their first matchup. I'm not sure he can continually do it, and I think he will walk his way into some sacks and some turnovers. So Washington, they're only owned in 14% of leagues to be my number 1. Are they number 1 for you, and is there someone else you'd look to?
Yeah, they're still very clearly number 1 for me. I think while Daniel Jones is good at I don't even know if he's not good at avoiding pressure, actually. He's just good at running. He's good at a thing that doesn't mean he doesn't take sacks. So I think Daniel Jones will be pressured a lot. Some of those convert to rush attempts, and a lot of those convert to sacks. So it's like Washington will get to him on, a third, a quarter, whatever it happens to be of his dropbacks. And enough of those convert to rush attempts that he has a good fantasy day. It does not in any way exclude Washington from also sacking him 4 or 5 times. So Washington, clearly number one, an incredible pass rush against a quarterback who just does no pressure when it's coming in his face.
Yeah, I would say that's all true. I think Washington's number one. Green Bay maybe number two, a defense that struggled based on what we expected and what we saw last year. But they take on San Francisco, and we already talked about the injury San Francisco sustained. We might not see Garoppolo or Kittle, and I think that would elevate Green Bay. Yeah. They're probably number two, but don't feel great about that. Any qualms with the listing there?
Well, I will only half ironically say having Nick Mullins in the lineup is maybe not even a downgrade. Yeah, it is probably a downgrade. So I think when you're getting a backup quarterback and a team without their number one receiver, potentially without their number one tight end, without like their top running back and other running backs on the roster, yeah, I think like the complete wasteland of talent that could potentially be San Francisco's absolutely one to target.
All right, guys, that's the waiver wire for week 9. Of course, I am Matt Gajewski. He is Kyle Dvorchak. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. You can follow him at Kyle Tweets here. Of course, if you missed this show on YouTube or you just don't want to have it open in your pocket, check out our podcast network. We are available everywhere you can find podcasts. Other than that, guys, good luck. We will see you again next week.